Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar for the welcome page. So glad for those of you that are joining us this afternoon. I know there has been a lot of questions about this topic that many of us have seen in the news related to the migrant caravan. And so we're really grateful to be able to address that this afternoon. Please feel free in the comments to let us know where you're from and to ask any questions that you might have during this talk. I'll do my best to facilitate those. My name is Sarah Casada. I am an author and an immigration advocate and have been very grateful to work with Welcome on helping us to have conversations and to be educated on these topics. Joining me today is Matthew Soerens from World Relief. He is very engaged and informed about these issues and travels all over the country talking to people about immigration and refugee issues. He is also the co-author of 2 books that I brought with me. I have visual aids. So I want to share them with you, and I'll share them again hopefully at the end. Welcoming the Stranger. This is like a go-to resource for learning about immigration, and Seeking Refuge on the refugee crisis. So he's co-authored both of these books and currently works with World Relief. Matthew, we're so grateful to have you joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here.
All right, so let's dive in. Thank you to those who are watching live and those that join us on the replay. We welcome you as well. Again, if you have questions, feel free to add them in the comments and we'll try to address them as we go along. But we have been hearing so much in the news about this migrant caravan traveling from Honduras through Guatemala and Mexico toward the U.S. We've heard our president saying, kind of threatening different reactions from deploying troops to restarting childhood separations, threatening foreign aid. What can you kind of tell us just about the origin of this caravan? Is this something that has happened before? Who's organizing it? Can you give us a little background?
Yeah, I mean, so this is not the first time there's been a caravan from Central America. This is probably the largest, at least at its peak, although it's already declined really significantly in terms of the size of the caravan. But what we often see is Central Americans have been coming north to the United States for decades for a variety of reasons, sometimes fleeing poverty, sometimes fleeing violence, sometimes trying to be reunited to family. And probably all of those people are in this caravan as well. Sometimes they come in a group in large part for protection because unfortunately the trip can be dangerous. A lot of women are raped, a lot of people are robbed. There's a lot of violence along that journey, especially if you're by yourself. In terms of how this caravan started, I think that nobody's completely clear on all the details. The best reporting that I've seen on this is that it probably started with something of a political statement in Honduras, with people who are opposed to the current government of Honduras feeling that they're not being treated well, kind of wanting to make a public statement and saying we're so upset about how we're being treated that we're leaving. And some of them may have very legitimate, even being afraid of violence or that sort of thing, or just the conditions of poverty. And it got so much media attention, both in Latin America, social media and television and radio, but also in the United States, that it became a global story. And that actually helped build the caravan. As people heard about it, they said, well, this is my opportunity because I need to get away from this country as well, whether that was Honduras or in people as they joined in Guatemala or even in Mexico, that people have joined in for that reason. So at this point, at one point, there was reports that the caravan was as many as 7,000 people. At this point, we think it's down to about 3,500 or 4,000, conflicting reports on exactly how many, but some people have already turned back because, of course, this is incredibly dangerous, difficult trip, even in a big group. It's a huge distance to cover, mostly on foot. And it's also, some people have been deported by the respective governments. Most of them have seemingly have been allowed to continue on, but some have been deported. Others have accepted asylum in Mexico. So they've said, the Mexican government has offered them asylum and they've said, we'll take that up. So we'll see. At this point, they're about 1,000 miles from the closest border with the United States. And I think that's really important to understand. It would take them weeks at their current pace to reach the United States if they do indeed arrive. And it's not clear that most of them would. In fact, there was a caravan that ended up reaching Tijuana, which is even further away because it's the far western edge of the country of Mexico. That caravan arrived in April, and it had been at one point 1,500, maybe even a couple thousand people, 100 by the time they made it to Tijuana. So it declined really dramatically. And I think another thing that's really important to understand is they were seeking asylum. They went to, the vast majority of them went to the port of entry, which U.S. law allows them to do, and said, I would like to request asylum in the United States. That's something that they're entitled to request under the Refugee Act of 1980 and international conventions that the United States is a party to. We've had these laws for a long time saying we will consider your case. Not that we will give everyone asylum or let everyone in. We certainly have never, in recent years have never said that. But we will consider your case, and if you have a well-founded fear of persecution because of your race, your religion, your political opinion, your national origin, we will not send you back. So that's what most of these people seem to be wanting to avail themselves of, is that offer of U.S. law. And that's, I think, what we're seeing with this caravan. But it's still very far, and it's quite unclear how many of these people will ever make it to the United States, if any of them.
So I feel like that's a question that we get a lot, both on this page for many topics.
Sarah, I might have lost you. So
you don't hear me?
I will just keep talking about right. What I know about what's happening with the caravan. Hopefully you're able to rejoin in a moment. I'm not sure if I'm being broadcast at the moment, but I think one thing, are you there, Sarah?
Can you hear me now?
I can now.
Oh, great. Oh, interesting. Sorry about that. I guess I got disconnected, but yeah, I wanted to ask you a little more about that, because that's a question we definitely get on this page, and especially in relation to this news about the caravan, is that why don't people just come the legal way? That we're open to people coming, quote unquote, the right way. What does that mean, and how is this different or similar to that?
Yeah, I mean, some of the critique in some of the media around this caravan has been, well, these people shouldn't be coming illegally. They should go back and apply for citizenship. And I think that sentiment makes a lot of sense to a lot of Americans. That makes sense to me. But my background is in immigration law, so I've learned that, for one, getting to the border and requesting asylum is a legal way. Frankly, for some of these people, probably most of them, it's the only legal way. And for many of them, it's still probably not a very good shot. They're probably going to be denied in many of the cases, but some of them will be approved that way. The reason it's the only way is because if you want to apply for citizenship in the United States, or actually the first step before you could ever apply for citizenship is you can apply for permanent residency. That means you're going to be an immigrant to the United States. To do so from your country of origin, you have to fit basically into one of four categories. You can be a family-sponsored immigrant. That means you've got a U.S. citizen relative in the United States, or in a few cases, a lawful permanent resident with their green card. A close relative, not your cousin or your uncle or aunt or your grandparent, but like a spouse or parent, sibling, child who's over 21 years old. And in some cases, those petitions take, 2 years or so, maybe six months to 2 years in the best of cases. In the worst of cases, like a married child of a U.S. citizen or a sibling of a U.S. citizen, it can literally take 20, 25 years from certain countries. So that is a possibility for some people, but probably not for most of these people, because they just don't have the right relative in the U.S. The next possibility would be an employer sponsorship. So you've got a company in the U.S. that wants to bring you to fill a job need. And frankly, we have a lot of job needs in the United States right now. We have an unemployment rate that is 3.7 or 8%, I believe. So there's actually more people, there's more jobs listed in this country right now than there are people looking for work. And our economy would probably benefit from some of these people coming lawfully. But our immigration system has not caught up to our unemployment rate, because our immigration quotas were mostly written in 1965 and amended most of them haven't been amended in decades. There are only 5,000 employer-sponsored immigrant visas available each year under the Immigration and Nationality Act as it currently stands that can possibly go to someone who does not classify as highly skilled. So if you've got a master's degree and you can find an employer that wants to hire you in the US, it's not easy, but it's maybe possible. But if you are coming to do what would be considered low-skilled labor, so agriculture or the hospitality industry, and I don't like that term low-skilled because those are hard jobs that require some skills. But the sort of thing that doesn't require a master's degree, basically there's no chance to come through an employer sponsor. And that's one of the things I think we should see fixed in our immigration system. The third possibility is if you are selected abroad as a refugee. So usually in most cases that means you've fled your country. But the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program last year it took 22,000 refugees, and there's 25 million refugees in the world. So the number of refugees was already a very small fraction of those in the world, like less than 0.1%. And it's gone down even further, and we expect it to decline even further. So frankly,
sorry to interrupt. These folks coming from Central America, do they have opportunity to apply for refugee status, or is that different?
Um, in most cases, probably not. They might have, in a few cases, they might meet the definition of a refugee, and that's frankly what they're trying to get to the border to say, is I meet the definition of a refugee. I've fled a well-founded fear of persecution because of my race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. It's possible in some cases, for example, Nicaraguans would be a situation right now. There's an incredibly repressive political situation in Nicaragua. Hundreds of people have been killed in politically motivated violence in the last several months. And so some of those people, if they got, for example, to Costa Rica, very likely would meet the definition of a refugee and might be considered for resettlement to the United States. But because so few people are being resettled from anywhere right now, their odds are pretty slim. And then the last piece is something called the diversity visa lottery. So your odds of, that's an online lottery. You have to have at least a high school education or 2 years of professional experience to win that, to be even qualified to enter it. And so that would probably exclude some of these folks in this caravan. But even if you do meet that qualification, you also can't be from Mexico or El Salvador. So most of these folks are from Guatemala or Honduras, so they'd probably be able to enter, but not the Salvadorans or Mexicans. And then the odds of winning last year were about 1 in 460 or so. So if you're fleeing for your life, you're probably not going to wait around for a 1 in 460 chance that you might be offered a visa to the United States 2 years from now after you enter. So if you're in an urgent situation of violence, or you're literally, there's just not enough food to eat, people are very desperate. So that goes to the question of why people can't just apply for citizenship. They mostly don't qualify. But if they do get to the border, and that's the only way they can do it, they have the right to request asylum. Doesn't mean they'll be granted it. They have to meet that legal definition of a well-founded fear of persecution for particular reasons under the law. But they're basically trying to get to the border to claim that right to request it, and then the U.S. government will adjudicate whether they qualify or not.
That's really helpful. Thank you for kind of laying out those different pathways. And it is really clarifying to realize that for many people, this is the only legal pathway available to them. And I know I had heard you speak recently on a little bit about the history of our asylum laws and where that came out of. And I'd love to hear you share that here as well.
Yeah, really the U.S. formalized its asylum system and its refugee system in the years and the decades after World War II. So in the days just before World War II, in the late 1930s, there was a particularly tragic situation where there was a shipload of Jewish people coming from Europe on the SS St. Louis who tried to get to the United States to seek protection, and they were turned away. They didn't fit there wasn't an asylum system at the time that required the United States to take them. They were turned away, and the majority of those people were killed in the Holocaust. And in the days after World War II, because it wasn't just the United States that made some of those decisions, Canada did, and many European countries didn't protect people. The largest powers of the world basically came together and said, we're never going to do that again. We made a mistake. We should protect people who are fleeing persecution, to protect human life. And out of this idea, very consistent with Christian principles, that every human life has inherent dignity because these are people made in the image of God. So the United States is a signatory to an international convention that came out of that era that defines who a refugee is. These individuals who have fled their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution, because of race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group, and says that we will not send anyone back to those circumstances who meets that legal definition. Now, you still got to get to the United States to request asylum. You've got to either get to the border or to an airport, which is very difficult because it's pretty difficult to get a tourist visa unless you're fairly wealthy from most lower income parts of the world. But once you get to the United States, our commitment as a nation, going back decades, has been that we won't send you back because we never want to do that again. And that's why I think it's really troubling to me that there's some discussions of maybe we should turn people back. Maybe we should not even give people a hearing. Let's just turn them around and send them back.
Yeah. We have a question from someone who's viewing live. Thank you guys for sharing your thoughts and questions. Brian says, my brother-in-law is a Vietnamese refugee and he's totally against the caravan. What would you say to him?
I think everybody's entitled to their own views on this, of course, and we want to respect that. Vietnamese refugees faced a situation that was probably fairly similar to that which at least some of the people in the caravan are facing now, where they were forced to flee after the fall of Saigon. And the United States, I think in a moment, I'm not proud of what our country did with Jewish refugees fleeing in the days before World War II. I'm quite proud of what we did with Vietnamese refugees. And of course, our country was involved in the situation in Vietnam, so maybe we had a unique moral responsibility there. But we took in hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees. In fact, in a single year in 1980, we took in more than 220,000 refugees, the vast majority of them from Vietnam, some from Laos, and
when you compare that to, you said last year we took in 22,000 refugees.
Exactly. I mean, it's been a real decline in the U.S. refugee resettlement program over the last few decades, and then most dramatically in the last couple of years. I mean, we were at about 85,000 in 2016. Now, those are people we identified abroad and brought to the United States. But in the second country that they fled to, they were a lot like these asylum seekers. They were people basically saying, I need a country to go to where you'll protect me because effectively the people allied with the United States had lost the war and were being persecuted in Vietnam at that time, and they needed to get out. And those people were welcomed into the United States. Often they were welcomed by local churches. That was the origins of World Relief's refugee resettlement program, was with those arrival of Vietnamese refugees. And local churches, both Protestant and Catholic, all across the country welcomed them in. And I think it's a unique success story because fast forward 30, 40 years, and Vietnamese Americans, who are almost entirely refugees or their family members, have higher average incomes than the average U.S. citizen. They are less likely to live in poverty. We've had now 2 different members of Congress who came to the United States as Vietnamese refugees, one Republican, one Democrat. And it's a beautiful story of strengthening the United States. But we didn't take them just because they had a lot to offer economically. We took them because they were in need. And frankly, we didn't have the vetting capacity back in the late 70s and early 80s that we have today to make sure we were taking the right people. In fact, polls at the time found most Americans did not want to take Vietnamese refugees. There was these rumors that maybe these could be communists. How do we know these aren't the wrong people? Of course, they're fleeing a communist government in North Vietnam, but that was the rhetoric of the time. But under President Reagan's leadership, under President Carter's leadership before that, we took an incredible number of Vietnamese refugees, and they have been a blessing to the country. And I think it would be a mistake. Now we're dealing with maybe 7,000 if all of them got here. And of course, others apply for asylum who don't come in a caravan. But the numbers are actually pretty minimal. We're a big country. We're a strong country. We can process people. We can, if we need to put more resources to process people in a timely way, I don't think anyone is suggesting we should just open the doors, let everybody in. But we should not just close the doors and say we will not consider your claim at the border, because if we do so, we risk sending people back to real violence and to really the threat of death even in some cases.
Well, your comment about some of the fears and rhetoric that was happening during the Vietnam refugee resettlement time is a perfect segue into this question, which we're hearing some fears about who is in this caravan. What if there are terrorists and different people who want to attack the United States being hidden by that group? And so I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on who's in that group and also that vetting process.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to go back to the reality that these people have, for the most part at least, said, and if you go look at the caravan that arrived in April, this was what happened. They want to go to the port of entry and legally request asylum, which means they will be subjecting themselves to a thorough vetting from the U.S. government. If you were trying to come and do harm to the United States, this would not be the way to come in. You would want to try to sneak in across the border, which is not easy to do. We've got lots of border patrol there, a lot more than we did 10 or 15 years ago. But it doesn't make sense to try to report yourself to the U.S. government if you have intentions to do harm. Now, I don't know who's in the caravan and every single person. I've seen news reports. There's been these sort of rumors of there could be Middle Easterners. No journalists have been able to find people of Middle Eastern origin among the caravan, but I can't confirm that. I will say the last time there was Middle Easterners in the news showing up at the U.S.-Mexico border that I'm aware of was in 2015. And there was politicians saying, how do we know this isn't ISIS? Well, it turned out they were Syrian Christians who had made a very difficult journey. They were able to get a visa to somewhere in the Western Hemisphere and make their way north, which is often how this works. Mexico usually won't give a visa to anyone who the U.S. won't give a visa to, because our governments work fairly collaboratively. But they made it somewhere in the Western Hemisphere. They made their way on a difficult journey because Syrian Christians are facing incredible persecution for their faith under ISIS. These were the victims of religious persecution, and they made it to the U.S.-Mexico border and they requested asylum. And I haven't followed their case to know if they were eventually approved or not. They probably had a very strong case, because that meets the definition of someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution because of their religion. I was in Tijuana 2 or 3 weeks ago, where there were already people waiting to request asylum at the border crossing. And there was people from the Congo in Central Africa. There was people from Cameroon. There was some people from Ukraine, people from Haiti. So it's not all Central Americans. Mostly it was, and some Mexicans, but relatively few Mexicans. But they all should have their opportunity to request asylum, and we should not let anyone in who is in any way a threat to the United States. But we can verify that when we're interviewing people on an individual basis. We can do background checks and retina scans and all the technology that we have to make sure that not only does someone meet the legal definition of asylum, having a well-founded fear of persecution, which some will and many probably will not, but also that they in no way present a threat in any way to the United States.
Well, that it leads into another question we received from Elizabeth that asks, where are people waiting and where do they receive assistance while they're waiting for the U.S. to decide if they meet that definition of a refugee or an asylum seeker, which I know there's some distinctions there as well.
Yeah, in some ways, the definition of a refugee and asylum seeker is similar. It's just a question of where it's being determined, whether overseas and then getting on an airplane or at the border or at an airport. But for those who are seeking asylum, they're reaching the United States. What's happening right now, and I don't know the exact, there's different ports of entry along the U.S.-Mexico border, but I was in the border crossing in Tijuana a few weeks ago, and I witnessed people who had gone forward to the port of entry and been told, turn around and wait your turn in line. And the problem is there's not really like a formal system for that. There's kind of this informal notebook that the people I saw said that they were asylum seekers themselves. It's a little unclear if the Mexican government is watching over this process or who's really in charge of it. But I witnessed people being told as they put their name in this notebook that their turn would probably come, their number would get called probably in 4 to 5 weeks. So in the meantime, there's a variety of shelters run by nonprofits, by churches mostly. The Catholic Church has done a great deal there in Tijuana. To provide people shelter because they're not from Mexico. For the vast majority of them are from Central America. They don't have family here. They don't know anyone here. And the churches are doing a great job of taking care of them, giving them a place to stay, though it's not the safest city in the world in Tijuana. And the parts of it that you hang out when you can't afford a nice hotel are particularly probably not where you want to be. There's serious risks for children of trafficking or other problems because some of these are even accompanied children. Some of my colleagues at World Relief go down on a regular basis because they're legal professionals and are either attorneys or accredited by the Department of Justice. They go down and do some legal orientations, visiting some of these shelters to help people understand what's going to happen next if they decide for asylum. In many cases, we have to tell people you're probably not likely to be approved. I mean, we don't make the decision for anyone, but if you're fleeing poverty, as sympathetic as that may be, that doesn't qualify you for asylum in the United States. So you need to understand that. You do have the right to request it, but you'll probably be detained. And you probably won't pass what's called a credible fear interview, which is kind of the first preliminary interview that's done. Mm-hmm. There are others who have very strong cases for asylum, who kind of fit the classic profile of someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution, let's say because of their Christian faith, or because of a political opinion in Nicaragua or in Venezuela, or because of their ethnicity. And some of these Cameroonian people are part of an English-speaking ethnic minority, and they're facing persecution that is really quite well documented. And I think they probably have a strong case.
Yeah.
I was going to say there's this other category of people that I think is worth mentioning who, if you ask them why they're fleeing, they would say violence. They wouldn't say poverty. But if you test that, you kind of go further. Well, why are you being persecuted? Is it because of your religion? No. Is it because of your ethnicity, political opinion? No. It's usually because the gangs are trying to extort them or recruit them. Gangs in Central America, especially El Salvador and Honduras, to some extent Guatemala as well, are really a horrific problem. I was in El Salvador a few years ago, and I mean, person after person I talked to talks about how just overwhelming it is in the whole country. People have moved, over and over again within the country, just try to escape a gang that's trying to harm them or has harmed them. At the border there a few weeks ago, I met a Guatemalan woman whose husband was murdered in front of her. And when that same gang threatened her and her children, she left. And at this point, she'd been coming to the border on a daily basis for 3 weeks, hoping that they would call her number to request asylum. And the really heartbreaking news is that while she very likely, and in fact, I believe at this point, has passed a credible fear interview, the next step of applying for asylum, you have to prove that your persecution is based on your race, religion, political opinion, national origin, or social group. And 6 months ago, she probably would have had a strong case because a lot of cases were being approved based on the idea that your people fleeing a gang or also people fleeing domestic violence could be considered a social group. But the Attorney General clarified a few months ago that someone fleeing persecution on account of their social group, if that persecution is what's considered private violence, not directed by a government, it will not qualify for asylum. So we've kind of changed the rules on people in the category that is probably the most common situation applying for asylum, particularly from Central America. Mm-hmm. So and it was hard for me to look at this woman and know that this was what was ahead for her is probably she might make it in for an initial interview. There's a very likely possibility that sooner or later she will be deported. And go back to that situation of violence. And my legal counselor colleagues have the hard work of telling people the truth, even when it's really hard to tell people. But we'll also make the best case we can for them if they do pass that preliminary credible fear interview. And my colleagues in Southern California represent people in the immigration asylum process and make the best case possible. But when the rules are changed, the law didn't change, but the interpretation of the law was changed. It makes it much more difficult.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was a few months ago, I was in Tijuana as well, and just thinking about what do people do when they're waiting. I was actually at the Salvation Army shelter for women and children and met women there with their infants and toddlers who were had already kind of taken a number at a port of entry and were just waiting for their case to be called. And it was essentially just a shelter and kind of like a homeless shelter, but just waiting for that number to be called. So it is a long process for many people who are already there. We've gotten a couple more questions, so I wanted to pass some of these along to you. Thanks, Andrew, for your question. It says some people are claiming this caravan is a political ploy. And so we've heard that, maybe Democrats have organized it to force Trump and the Republicans during the election. Is there any evidence of this, or where did that thought come from?
I don't know where the thought comes from. I mean, obviously the president has stated that. I've also seen no evidence that the origins are in any political party in the United States. I think there is probably some truth to the idea that there was a political motivation to this in Honduras. So, I mean, that's not to say that people are not legitimately fleeing persecution or fleeing poverty, but some of them probably saw joining this caravan and sort of announcing we're leaving, almost as an exodus. It's almost has sort of biblical ramifications. It's a statement against the government in Honduras, which, I'm not an expert in if that's a good government or not. Most governments are a little more complicated than good or bad. So I think there's political dynamics there. And I also think the fact that we're talking about this, frankly, is a political dynamic. I don't know that we would be talking about it if it wasn't today, 1 week before a midterm election. But there are incentives on various sides to make this an issue. The reality is this is a few thousand people 1,000 miles from the United States who might or might not show up several weeks from now, who have said that they are asking for asylum, which is you usually do at the port of entry. The last time one of these things happened, and they arrived in April in Tijuana, again, there were about 1,500 of them. It was down to, just a few hundred by the time they arrived. About 401 people approached the port of entry and requested asylum. 374 of them, or about 93%, passed that first round of interviews, the credible fear interview, which is actually higher than the average, ratio of approvals for people requesting asylum. A few of them also were apprehended crossing the border unlawfully. I think the number I've seen reported by USA Today was 122 people. That doesn't mean they weren't seeking asylum, because the law actually says explicitly you can seek asylum at the port of entry, or if you're apprehended crossing the border unlawfully, you can still seek asylum. But we don't have good data on how many of those were approved. But part of the reason people do go out into the desert and look for a Border Patrol agent not at a port of entry is because if you've been waiting 3 weeks and you're desperate enough, you might say, I need to get, to have my asylum claim considered. Some people have situations of violence even in Mexico that they are afraid of. And so, people are very desperate in some cases.
That makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you another question that comes from Deborah. And I, as someone who has been grown up in church and around a lot of Christians, she says, I hear this particularly from Christians, that we are a country of a rule of law and to get in line. And she says, she acknowledged that you've given some responses to that, but is just sort of asking what you would say to people who that's their response to this situation.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And we are a country of rule of law, and the law is really important. That's why I'm not an advocate for saying everyone who gets to the U.S. should be able to come in. I think we need to have secure borders. I think that's appropriate. I do think we also have the opportunity in a democracy to change our laws and say, actually, we should be taking more people for economic reasons. And I have certainly advocated that. But we need to, if we're going to be about the rule of law, we need about the whole of the rule of law. And the rule of law says if you show up at the port of entry and request asylum, you should have a hearing. And frankly, it's questionable. It's arguably not legal for them to be turning people away and saying come back in 4 to 5 weeks, which is currently happening. That's not the rule of law that should happen either. But it would be, there's been reports that the administration is considering shutting down asylum processing at the U.S.-Mexico border altogether.
Yeah.
And that's I can't verify those reports. I hope actually those reports are not true, and maybe that won't happen. But there's been several media reports citing unnamed White House sources. So again, give that the credence you want. But I think it would be a mistake if that is being seriously considered, and arguably, I think the courts would step in fairly quickly and say it's not legal. It's not in line with the Refugee Act of 1980, which Congress passed and the president signed. It's not consistent with the Protocol on Refugees, to which the U.S. is a signatory since 1967. So the rule of law matters, and if we are not giving each asylum seeker a fair hearing, we are not abiding by the terms of U.S. law. And if people don't like that system, they should change the law through Congress, but it is the law that we currently have. And I think it's in place for good reasons to protect people from being sent back to harm.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. Matthew Soerens is with World Relief and is just one of the most informed, balanced, compassionate, just super smart voices on immigration and refugee issues. I again just want to share with you, if you weren't here at the very beginning, books that he's co-authored. One is called Welcoming the Stranger, and this is a revised and expanded edition that came out this year. And he also co-authored Seeking Refuge. And so I just want to make sure you're aware of those resources, because it is so evident, Matt, that you have done significant research as well as personal experience with both immigrant and refugee populations to be able to offer this just really informative and clarifying information. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for those of you who watched and asked questions. I hope that this was helpful for you, and we will be signing off. But thank you so much, Matt.
Thanks so much, Sarah.